The State Attorney General's Fraud Investigation Unit arrived at Riverside Manor on a Wednesday afternoon. The administrator's face went white when they presented the subpoena. By Thursday morning, the facility's notary public had been arrested. By Friday, the State Banking Commission had frozen multiple accounts. By the following Tuesday, 3 staff members faced felony forgery charges, and the facility's operating license was suspended. Everyone eventually learned the name Helen Castellanos, not as the quiet woman in room 22 who spent her days reading, but as the retired head librarian who had spent 40 years authenticating historical documents and had just exposed the largest elder financial fraud scheme in New York State history. It all started with 9 words she wasn't supposed to hear. Room 22 signed 3 documents today during bingo. She has no idea what she's signing. Dementia's pretty advanced. But the notary doesn't care as long as we pay her fee. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Helen Castellanos woke at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, the autumn light filtering through the thin curtains of room 22 at Riverside Manor Senior Community. The room smelled like the lemon furniture polish they used every Monday, mixed with the underlying scent of old carpet and institutional cooking from the kitchen 3 floors below. She could hear the Hudson River from here if she opened her window, a soft rushing sound that reminded her of turning pages in the rare books room at the library, that whisper of paper and possibility. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting the movement. 79 years showed themselves most clearly in the morning. The stiffness in her hands, the ache in her lower back, the way her knees required careful negotiation before they'd support her weight. But her mind was clear, sharp as the day she'd retired from the New York Public Library system 12 years ago. Clearer, perhaps, now that she didn't have the constant pressure of acquisitions budgets and staffing schedules and the endless battles to keep library funding from being cut yet again. The room was small, but she'd made it hers. Books lined every available surface, her personal collection, the ones she'd kept when she'd downsized from the house in Kingston. First editions mostly, carefully preserved in archival quality covers. A 1925 first edition of The Great Gatsby, a 1960 To Kill a Mockingbird, a 1937 of Mice and Men. Not the most valuable in monetary terms, those she'd had to sell to help fund her move here, but the ones that mattered to her personally, the books that had shaped her understanding of what literature could do. On her dresser sat a photograph of Martin, her husband, taken in 1972 at the library where they'd met. He'd been a professor of literature at SUNY New Paltz, had come to consult the library's collection of 19th century manuscripts. She'd been the archivist assigned to help him. They'd married 8 months later. He died 6 years ago, suddenly a heart attack while gardening. Everything after that had been a slow process of letting go, the house too big, the maintenance too much, her niece Amanda suggesting that maybe it was time to consider a community setting where you'd have help if you needed it. Amanda had found Riverside Manor. It's perfect, Aunt Helen. Close enough for me to visit, affordable on your retirement income, and they have a library. The library had turned out to be 3 shelves of dog-eared paperbacks and inspirational volumes in the common room. But by then, Helen had already signed the papers, already sold most of her rare book collection to pay the entrance fee, already accepted that this was the next chapter. That had been 14 months ago. She'd adapted, as she always had, found routines, established patterns, made the best of limited circumstances. It was what librarians did: work with the resources available, find creative solutions, maintain order in systems that wanted to devolve into chaos. The breakfast cart rattled down the hallway at 7:15 a.m. Jade, one of the regular aides, brought her tray. "Morning, Ms. Castellanos," she said, setting it on the rolling table. Oatmeal with brown sugar, wheat toast, coffee, orange juice, the morning medications in a small paper cup, blood pressure pill, calcium supplement, low-dose aspirin. "Good morning, Jade," Helen said. She'd learned all the staff names within her first week, had memorized their schedules within a month. Detail orientation was both gift and curse. She noticed everything, remembered everything, couldn't help cataloging and organizing information even when it served no practical purpose. Jade left, hurrying to the next room. Helen ate her breakfast methodically, took her medications, drank her coffee while reading the previous day's New York Times that someone had left in the common room. She still read the paper every day, still kept up with book reviews and publishing news, still maintained her professional identity even though her profession had ended. At 9:30 a.m., Activities Director Carol appeared in her doorway. "Helen, we're doing bingo in the community room at 10. You should come down. It's fun, and there are prizes." Helen had been to bingo once, found it mind-numbingly tedious, but refusing activities led to notes in her file about social isolation and potential depression, so she made token appearances. "I'll come down for a little while," she said. The community room held about 20 residents, most significantly more impaired than Helen. Mrs. Chen from room 8 rarely spoke anymore, sat staring at nothing. Mr. Rodriguez from room 15 called out random numbers regardless of what was actually called. Miss Kowalski from room 11 needed help holding her bingo markers, her trembling hands unable to manage the small pieces. Carol called numbers with aggressive cheerfulness. "B7, remember, B like boy, 7. Helen daubed her card without enthusiasm, winning nothing, wanting nothing except for the hour to end so she could return to her room and her books. But then, at 10:47 a.m. precisely, something changed. A woman Helen didn't recognize entered the room, middle-aged, professional attire, carrying a leather portfolio. She went directly to the corner where Vanessa, the facility's administrative assistant, sat with a small folding table. The woman opened the portfolio, removed several documents, spread them on the table. Helen watched with the automatic attention to detail that 40 years of archival work had ingrained. The woman was a notary. Helen could see the embossing seal, the stamp, the official forms. Vanessa was guiding residents over to the table, one at a time. "Mrs. Anderson, remember we talked about updating your power of attorney. Just sign here. Mr. Kim, the facility needs your signature for the new medication consent forms." Helen observed Mrs. Anderson, severe dementia, rarely recognized her own children. She made a shaky mark on the paper, clearly not reading it, not understanding what she was signing. The notary stamped the document, wrote something in her log, moved on to the next person. "Ms. Castellanos," Vanessa had appeared at her side. "We need to update some of your paperwork. Just routine administrative things. Come sign while the notary's here." Every instinct Helen had developed over 4 decades screamed warning. "What documents?" she asked. "Oh, just updates to your residency agreement. New state regulations. You know how it is. Takes 2 minutes." "I'd like to review the documents first," Helen said. "I don't sign anything without reading it." Vanessa's smile tightened. "It's really just formalities, Ms. Castellanos. Everyone's signing them today." "Then I can take them to my room and bring them back signed tomorrow. The notary is only here today. It needs to be done now." "Then it can wait until the notary returns," Helen said pleasantly but firmly. "I never sign documents I haven't read. Professional habit." Vanessa's expression flickered with annoyance before the professional mask returned. "Of course. We'll arrange another time." She moved away quickly, targeting an easier mark, Mr. Washington from room 18, who would sign anything put in front of him. Helen returned to her room at 11:15, troubled. Something about the entire interaction felt wrong. The pressure to sign immediately, the notary during a recreational activity when residents would be distracted, the documents given to people who clearly lacked capacity to understand what they were signing. That afternoon, she went to the facility's small library and sat in the chair by the window where she could see the community room entrance. At 2:30 p.m., she watched the notary leave, portfolio thick with newly signed documents. At 2:35 p.m., Vanessa and another administrator, Diane, the facility's business manager, stood in the hallway just outside the library entrance, speaking in low voices. Helen remained perfectly still, appearing to be absorbed in her book. But she was listening with the focused attention she'd used in graduate school, in archives where a whispered conversation might contain the key to authenticating a disputed manuscript. "How many today?" Diane's voice, hushed but carrying. 14 signatures, Vanessa replied. Anderson, Kim, Washington, Kowalski, the usual compliant ones. Couldn't get Castellanos. She wanted to read everything first, asked too many questions. Room 22 signed 3 documents today during bingo. She has no idea what she's signing, dementia's pretty advanced, but the notary doesn't care as long as we pay her fee. Diane's voice was matter-of-fact, casual. Corporate wants 20 signatures per visit minimum. We'll need to push harder at the next session. What about Castellanos? She's going to be a problem. Her niece handles everything. Call Amanda, tell her Aunt Helen is becoming difficult about routine paperwork. Suggest she might need a competency evaluation. Amanda wants to sell that book collection anyway. She'll authorize whatever we need. They moved down the hallway, voices fading. Helen sat in her chair, book forgotten in her lap, mind racing. They were forging signatures, getting residents with dementia to sign documents they didn't understand during activities designed to distract and confuse. Room 22 was Mrs. Anderson. Helen had just watched her sign 3 documents without reading them, without understanding them. The notary was complicit, paid to provide false authentication, and Amanda was involved. Her niece, her only living family, was working with the facility to somehow profit from Helen's book collection, while having Helen declared incompetent so she couldn't object. Helen's hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from rage that she forced herself to contain. She'd spent 40 years preserving documents, authenticating signatures, protecting historical integrity. She knew forgery when she saw it, she knew exploitation when she encountered it, and she knew how to build a case with documentary evidence that would hold up under scrutiny. That evening, she began planning her investigation with the same methodical approach she'd used for archival projects. First, establish the scope. How long had this been happening? How many residents affected? What documents were being forged? Second, gather evidence. She needed to see the documents, analyze the signatures, document the pattern of fraud. Third, identify the legal violations, notary fraud, elder financial abuse, possible identity theft, breach of fiduciary duty. Fourth, determine who to contact. Adult Protective Services, State Attorney General's office, possibly the FBI if it crossed state lines. The challenge was capability. She was 79, living in a facility that now saw her as a problem to be managed. She had no computer in her room, limited privacy, no access to legal resources. Amanda controlled her finances through a trust arrangement they'd set up to make things easier. But she had something they'd forgotten she possessed: 40 years of experience investigating documents, tracking provenance, building irrefutable evidence chains. She knew how to research, she knew how to verify, she knew how to authenticate, and how to expose forgeries. Over the next week, Helen watched and documented. She kept notes in a small journal disguised as a reading diary, recording times, names, observations. She watched which residents were targeted during activities, always the ones with obvious cognitive impairment. She noted when the notary came, twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, always during group activities. She befriended Mrs. Anderson's daughter during a family visiting day. "Your mother seems to be signing a lot of paperwork lately," Helen mentioned casually. "I hope everything's all right." The daughter looked confused. "Paperwork? Mom hasn't signed anything in years. She can barely write her own name anymore." "Interesting," Helen said. "I must have been mistaken." But she wasn't mistaken. She'd watched Mrs. Anderson sign 3 documents the previous Thursday. Someone was either forging the signatures or obtaining them through fraud, then using them for purposes the families didn't know about. Helen requested a meeting with Diane, the business manager, claiming she wanted to understand her own financial arrangements better. Diane was professionally pleasant but evasive. "Your niece Amanda handles all your finances, Miss Castellanos. We coordinate directly with her. Everything's well managed." "I'd like to see the residency agreement I signed when I moved in," Helen said, "for my records." "We'll get you a copy. May take a few days to locate it in the files." The copy never came. Helen requested it again a week later, then again. Each time Diane promised to locate it. Each time nothing materialized. The stonewalling was itself evidence. They didn't want her seeing what she'd actually signed versus what they might have altered since. She called Amanda from the facility phone in her room, knowing the calls were probably monitored but needing to test her niece's knowledge and involvement. "Aunt Helen, hi, is everything okay?" Amanda's voice was bright, cheerful, California sunshine even through the phone line. "I'm fine, dear. I had a question about my book collection. Have you had any of the pieces appraised recently?" A tiny pause, barely perceptible. "Appraised? No, why would I? They're in storage, like we discussed. I just wanted to make sure they're being properly preserved. Some of those first editions require climate control." "They're fine, Aunt Helen. Don't worry about it." Amanda's tone had shifted slightly, an edge of impatience. Was there something else? "The facility mentioned updating some paperwork. They wanted me to sign documents during bingo of all things. Seemed unusual." Another pause, longer this time. "If the facility needs you to sign something, you should probably just sign it, Aunt Helen. They're professionals. They know what they're doing." "I prefer to read documents before signing them. Professional habit from the library." "Well, yes, but sometimes you have to trust that people have your best interests at heart." Amanda's voice had taken on a patronizing quality Helen recognized, the tone people used with the elderly when they thought them incapable of good judgment. "The facility called me, actually. They're concerned you're becoming a little resistant to routine care, maybe getting confused about what's important. I thought we might schedule a doctor's appointment just to check in on how you're doing cognitively." There it was. The threat delivered with concern but unmistakable. Cooperate or be declared incompetent. "I'm not confused, Amanda. I'm careful. There's a difference." "Of course you're not confused, Aunt Helen. I just want to make sure you're getting the support you need. I'll talk to the facility about scheduling that appointment. Love you." She hung up before Helen could respond. Helen sat with the phone in her hand, understanding fully now. Amanda was coordinating with the facility. They'd alerted her to Helen's non-compliance, and Amanda had responded exactly as they'd hoped, threatening a competency evaluation. Helen put the phone down carefully. She'd raised Amanda after her parents died in a car accident when Amanda was 12. Helen and Martin had given her a home, paid for her education, helped her through college and into her career, and now Amanda was willing to have her declared incompetent rather than let her ask questions about her own affairs. The betrayal hurt. But Helen had lived through Martin's death, had learned that grief was something you acknowledged and then worked through. She didn't have time for hurt feelings now. She had work to do. That night, she made a decision. If they wouldn't give her the documents, she'd have to obtain them herself. In her 40 years as a librarian and archivist, she'd developed certain skills: quiet movement through restricted stacks, finding filed materials others had hidden or misplaced, accessing information that wasn't meant to be easily accessible. She'd never used those skills for anything questionable. But this wasn't questionable. These were her own documents, her own legal agreements, information she had every right to see. The administrative offices were on the first floor, locked after 5 p.m., but Helen had watched the evening maintenance worker, Luis, for months. She knew he propped open the supply closet door with a doorstop when he was working nearby, knew he kept his key ring hanging from his cart while he cleaned. On a Wednesday evening at 8:17 p.m., Helen made her way slowly down the stairs. The elevator had cameras, the stairwell didn't. She wore dark clothing, moved carefully, stayed close to walls. At 79, she was not designed for covert operations, but she'd spent decades navigating library stacks in the dark, finding books by feel and memory. This was just a different kind of archive. Luis's cart sat in the hallway near the administrative suite, his keys hanging from the side. He was inside one of the offices, vacuum running. Helen had perhaps 3 minutes. She took the keys with a smooth motion, honed by years of reshelf management, found the one labeled Admin, unlocked the suite door. The outer office was dark, but enough light came from the hallway to navigate. She found the filing cabinets along the back wall, labeled by room number, room 22, her file. She removed it carefully, brought it to Diane's desk where a small lamp provided enough light to read. The file was thick, 14 months of daily logs, medical notes, financial records. Helen's eyes moved rapidly, trained by decades of document review. She found her original residency agreement, the one she'd signed when moving in. Then she found 2 others dated later, with signatures that looked like hers, but weren't quite right. The pressure was different, the formation of certain letters slightly off. She'd authenticated thousands of signatures in her career. These were forgeries, good ones, but not perfect. The later agreements had different terms, increased fees, changed provisions about who controlled her finances, altered clauses about power of attorney. Someone had forged new agreements to extract more money and control. She found similar patterns in other files she could reach. Mrs. Anderson, Mr. Kim, Miss Kowalski. All had multiple agreements with suspiciously similar signatures, all with altered financial terms favoring the facility. Helen heard the vacuum shut off. Louise would be moving to the next room soon. She had perhaps 90 seconds. She couldn't take the files, that would alert them immediately, but she could document what she'd found. She pulled out the small notebook she carried, wrote rapidly, dates of forged documents, names of affected residents, specific alterations to agreements. Her handwriting was shaky from haste, but legible. 40 years of taking research notes in uncomfortable positions served her well now. She returned the files, relocked the cabinets, slipped out of the office. Luis was in the hallway now, moving his cart. Helen pressed herself into a doorway alcove, waited for him to pass, then made her way back to the stairwell. By 8:35 p.m. she was back in her room, heart pounding, hands shaking, but with concrete evidence of the fraud pattern. She'd seen the documents. She'd compared the signatures. She knew what they were doing. Now she needed to get this information to someone who could act on it. The next morning, Helen requested a visitor pass for a friend, technically allowed but rarely done. "My college roommate is coming to town," she told the front desk. "I'd like to meet her in the family visiting room." The pass was approved. Helen called her friend Elizabeth, also retired from the library system, now living in Kingston. "Beth, I need a favor. Can you come visit tomorrow? I'll explain when you get here." Elizabeth arrived Friday afternoon. They sat in the family visiting room with the door closed. Residents were allowed privacy during family visits, even if staff didn't like it. Helen laid out everything she'd discovered. Elizabeth, who'd worked in legal archives, understood immediately. "Helen, this is felony fraud. Multiple felonies. You need to report this to the Attorney General." "I need help getting the information out. They monitor my phone calls. My mail, probably. Amanda's working with them." Elizabeth pulled out her own cell phone. "Use this. Call now. I'll stay here as witness." Helen dialed the New York State Attorney General's Elder Fraud Hotline. A woman answered, took her report with careful attention. "Ms. Castellanos, what you're describing is serious. Can you provide documentation?" "I have notes from files I accessed. I can identify forged signatures. I worked in authentication for 40 years. I can provide expert testimony on signature analysis." "We'll need to send investigators. Can you be available next week?" "I'm not going anywhere," Helen said dryly. "I live here." The investigator laughed slightly. "Fair point. Someone will contact you to set up an interview. In the meantime, document everything you can, but don't put yourself at risk." After Elizabeth left, Helen felt both relief and dread. She'd reported the crime, but now she'd have to survive until investigators arrived, and the facility would be watching her even more carefully. That evening, Diane appeared at her door. "Ms. Castellanos, I understand you had a visitor today." "My college friend, Elizabeth. We have visiting rights." "Of course. I just wanted to check in on how you're doing. The staff mentioned you've seemed a bit agitated lately. Are you sleeping well?" The subtext was clear. They were building a case for incompetency, documenting her as agitated and confused. "I'm sleeping fine," Helen said. "I'm not agitated. I'm observant. There's a difference." Diane's smile was thin. "Your niece mentioned you might benefit from a cognitive assessment. We're arranging that for next week." "I don't consent to any assessment." "Your niece has medical power of attorney, Ms. Castellanos. She can authorize assessments on your behalf." Helen felt cold fury settle over her. "Amanda doesn't have medical power of attorney. I never signed that authorization." "Actually, you did. It was part of your updated residency agreement from last spring." The forged agreement. They were using it to claim authority they didn't legally have. "I'd like to see that agreement," Helen said. "Of course, I'll make sure you get a copy." She wouldn't. Helen knew that now. They'd continue, stalling, continue building their incompetency case, continue exploiting residents while claiming legal authority based on forged documents. But Helen had one advantage. She'd already reported them. Investigators were coming. She just had to stay clear-headed and capable until they arrived. Over the weekend, Helen noticed increased surveillance. Staff checked on her more frequently. Her mail didn't arrive. A letter from Elizabeth that should have come Saturday never appeared. Her phone calls were clearly being monitored. When she tried calling the Attorney General's office again to follow up, the line was mysteriously out of service. On Monday, Vanessa appeared with paperwork for a psychiatric evaluation scheduled for Wednesday. "Dr. Morrison will be coming to assess your cognitive status," she said brightly. "Your niece Amanda arranged everything." "I don't consent," Helen said again. "Your medical power of attorney has already consented on your behalf." Helen felt the walls closing in. If they could get a doctor to declare her incompetent, they'd move her to the memory care unit, isolate her, prevent her from communicating with investigators. They'd done it to Vernon Oates, the resident commander Harris had mentioned in his case. They'd do it to her. On Tuesday morning, Helen was sitting in her room when someone knocked. She opened the door to find a man in his 40s, professional attire, carrying a briefcase. "Ms. Castellanos, I'm Robert Chen, senior investigator with the New York State Attorney General's office. May I come in?" Relief flooded through her. "Yes, please." He closed the door, pulled out identification, a recording device. "I'm here to take your formal statement about the allegations you reported. Before we begin, I need to tell you that we've been investigating Riverside Manor for 3 months based on other complaints. Your call last week provided specific evidence we'd been missing. We're prepared to move quickly." For the next 2 hours, Helen provided everything she knew: dates, names, resident examples, details about the forged signatures, information about Amanda's involvement, and the facility's threats regarding competency evaluations. Robert took extensive notes. "Ms. Castellanos, your background in archival authentication is incredibly valuable. Would you be willing to serve as an expert witness when this goes to trial?" "Absolutely." "We'll need to keep you safe in the meantime. The facility doesn't know I'm here. I came in as a family visitor, didn't alert them, but they'll figure it out. Are you comfortable staying here until we execute the warrants?" "I've been uncomfortable for months, Mr. Chen. A few more days won't matter." He smiled. "You're remarkable, ma'am. Most people in your situation would be too intimidated to fight back." "I'm a librarian," Helen said. "We fight for information rights. We protect documents from those who'd corrupt them. We organize chaos into understanding. This is just what librarians do." The warrants were executed Wednesday morning, the day Helen's psychiatric evaluation had been scheduled. Instead of Dr. Morrison, state investigators arrived with authorization to seize all financial records, all resident files, all corporate communications. The notary was arrested at her home. Diane and Vanessa were taken into custody at the facility. Amanda was arrested in California the same day. The corporate fraud investigation had revealed she'd been selling pieces of Helen's book collection for 3 years, pocketing the money while falsifying documents claiming the sales were for Helen's care costs. She'd been receiving monthly payments from Riverside Manor's corporate parent company in exchange for keeping Helen compliant and referring other potential residents. The investigation expanded rapidly. Riverside Manor was part of a corporate network operating in 6 states. Similar fraud patterns emerged at 13 other facilities. The scheme had been running for 5 years, had defrauded over 200 elderly residents of millions of dollars collectively. Helen's book collection was recovered, most of it. Amanda had sold some pieces, but the most valuable ones remained in storage. The first edition, Gatsby, The Mockingbird, The Steinbeck, all there, carefully preserved despite Amanda's theft of other items. The trial took 9 months. Helen testified as expert witness on signature authentication, explaining to the jury exactly how she'd identified the forgeries, what techniques the perpetrators had used, where they'd made mistakes. Her 40 years of experience gave her testimony unassailable authority. The defense attorneys couldn't shake her knowledge or her credibility. All defendants were convicted. Diane received 7 years for elder fraud and forgery. Vanessa received 5. The notary lost her license and received 3 years. Amanda, Helen's niece, the girl she'd raised, received 6 years for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and participating in a conspiracy to commit fraud. Helen sat in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, feeling no triumph, only tired sadness. Justice was necessary, but it couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't restore the trust that had been shattered. After the trial, Helen moved to a different facility, a smaller one, nonprofit, with transparent financial practices and rigorous oversight. She brought her books, her experience, and her continued vigilance. She also brought new purpose. The Attorney General's office asked her to consult on other elder fraud cases, to teach investigators how to spot forged documents and exploitative patterns. She created a training program for adult protective services workers on document authentication. She wrote articles for professional journals about protecting elderly residents from financial exploitation. At 80 years old, Helen became an advocate for elder rights, a consultant on fraud prevention, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Libraries called her to give talks about document security. Legal organizations asked her to develop protocols for verifying signatures from elderly or impaired individuals. On a morning in late spring, Helen sat in her new room, larger, brighter, with better light for reading. Her books surrounded her, properly preserved, rightfully hers. Outside her window, she could see a garden where residents grew vegetables, where children from a nearby school came to visit, where life continued with dignity and purpose. She'd spent 40 years as a librarian, preserving information, protecting documents, maintaining the integrity of historical records. She'd spent 1 year discovering that those same skills could protect people, not just papers. The betrayal by Amanda still hurt. That wound would probably never fully heal. The girl she'd raised, given a home and a future, had repaid her with exploitation and theft. But Helen had learned that family wasn't defined by blood alone. Elizabeth visited twice a month. Other residents became friends. The staff treated her with genuine respect, not the patronizing, false cheer of Riverside Manor. And she had work that mattered. Every consultation, every case she helped solve, every resident she protected from similar fraud, those were victories that meant something. Helen Castellanos was 80 years old, living in an assisted care facility because her body required help that her mind did not. She had arthritis in her hands and needed a walker for stability. She took medication for blood pressure and osteoporosis and the various small indignities of age. But she was not diminished. She was not voiceless. She was not a problem to be managed. She was a librarian, an archivist, an expert in authentication and truth. She had exposed a criminal enterprise, protected vulnerable elderly people, brought justice where there had been exploitation. Some things she'd learned you never retired from: protecting information, seeking truth, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She opened her first edition Gatsby, felt the weight of the pages, breathed in the scent of old paper and possibility. Somewhere in California, Amanda was serving her sentence. Somewhere in New York, Riverside Manor stood empty, its operating license permanently revoked. Somewhere across 6 states, elderly residents were a little safer because Helen had refused to sign documents during bingo. Helen read the familiar opening lines. "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice." She smiled slightly. She'd been young once, had been vulnerable once, but she'd also learned when to be suspicious, when to trust her professional judgment, when to fight. And at 80 years old, with arthritis and a walker and decades of experience authenticating documents, she'd proven that librarians never really retire. They just change which archives they're protecting.